In September 2018, a daughter went looking for her mother. Kim Freitag had not heard from her mother, Martha, in over 5 weeks. No calls, no texts, nothing. Martha was not the kind of woman who disappeared without a word. She was not the kind of woman who went quiet. Kim knew her mother, and Kim knew something was wrong. She called the police. They came, they looked around, they left. Kim called again. She told them about the man living in her mother's house, a boyfriend with a history of violence, a man her mother had been afraid of, a man her mother had tried to get a restraining order against just weeks before she went silent. The police told Kim there was nothing to investigate. Her mother was an adult. Adults are allowed to go quiet. What the police did not know was that Martha Robin Freitag was already dead. She had been beaten to death inside her own home. Her body was wrapped in plastic, covered in bedding, and buried in the fire pit in her own backyard. Her possessions were burned, so nothing remained. The man who did it was still living in her house, sleeping in her bed, eating her food. While Kim was making phone calls and putting up missing person flyers across Akron, her mother was 10 feet from the back door. For over a month, nobody came. This is the story of Martha Robin Freitag, a woman who saw what was coming, asked for help, and was failed by every person with the power to protect her. And this is the story of the daughter who refused to stop until the world knew what happened to her mother. Welcome to Crime on Record. Every case on record. Let's get into it. Martha Robin Freitag was 54 years old when she was killed. She lived in a modest home on Krause Street in Akron, Ohio, a quiet residential street in a working-class neighborhood where people knew their neighbors and looked out for each other. The kind of street where you would notice if something was wrong next door. Martha was not a woman with many advantages in life. She had struggled with paranoid schizophrenia for much of her adult life, a condition that is difficult to live with under any circumstances. A condition that requires stability, support, and people around you who take your concerns seriously. Martha did not always have those things. Her illness had a direct and devastating effect on how the people around her responded when she needed help. When she called police to report that she felt unsafe, they knew her history. They had been to her house before. They had responded to calls before. And over time, they had developed a habit of treating her concerns as less credible than those of someone without her diagnosis. They had learned to discount what she said. That pattern of dismissal did not begin in 2018. It had been building for years, and Martha Freitag paid for it with her life. But Martha was more than her diagnosis. She was more than a case file in the Akron Police Department's system. She was a mother. Her daughter Kim was the most important person in her world. They were close in the way that mothers and daughters who have been through difficult times together become close. Kim knew her mother's rhythms. She knew how Martha communicated, how often she checked in, what it meant when she went quiet. Kim was not someone who would miss the signs that something was wrong. Martha also had a network of people who cared about her, cousins, friends who had known her for years, people who described her as generous, warm, someone who would give you everything she had, even when she had almost nothing. Her cousin, Stephen Bennett, said after her death that Martha was a very loving person who was always smiling and would give you the shirt off her back if it was her last one. That was the woman David Callahan killed. Not a statistic, not a missing person file. A real woman with people who loved her. Now we need to talk about David Callahan, because understanding who he was and how he ended up in Martha's house is essential to understanding how this happened. David Callahan had a criminal record in Akron that stretched all the way back to 1989, nearly 30 years of run-ins with the law by the time he killed Martha. Drug abuse charges, theft, criminal trespass, domestic violence. He was not a man with a single mistake in his past. He was a man with a documented pattern of behavior that anyone looking at his record could see clearly. He and Martha had an on-and-off relationship that had been going for years, the kind of relationship that cycles through separation and reconciliation repeatedly. Martha had recognized at some point that Callahan was dangerous. She had taken out a restraining order against him. She had tried to create legal distance between herself and a man she knew was capable of hurting her. But restraining orders are pieces of paper. They do not physically remove someone from your life. And at some point before the summer of 2018, Callahan had found his way back in. He was living in Martha's house again, sleeping under her roof, eating her food, present in her daily life. In late July 2018, Martha Freitag called the Akron Police Department one more time. She wanted to know if she could get her restraining order against Callahan reinstated. She was telling them directly that she was afraid of the man in her house. She was asking for protection in the clearest possible terms. Police did not act on it. That was the last contact Martha Freitag had with anyone outside her home. Within days, she was dead. To understand what David Callahan did to Martha Freitag, you need to understand what kind of man David Callahan was long before he ever met her. Callahan was 53 years old in the summer of 2018. He had spent the better part of 3 decades accumulating a criminal record in Akron that read like a timeline of escalating disregard for other people. Drug abuse charges going back to 1989, theft, criminal trespass, domestic violence, probation violations so frequent that the courts had revoked his probation on multiple occasions. He was not a man who had made one bad decision in a moment of weakness. He was a man who had demonstrated consistently and repeatedly over nearly 30 years that he did not respect the law, did not respect other people, and did not face any meaningful consequences for any of it. He had never served significant prison time despite all of it. He had been in and out of the system for decades, and the system had largely let him walk. Fine after fine, probation after probation. A revolving door that kept putting him back on the street and back into the lives of the people around him. That is the man Martha Freitag was dealing with. Their relationship had been going on for years before 2018. The kind of relationship that people on the outside look at and struggle to understand. How does someone keep letting a person like that back in? The answer is almost never simple. Relationships with people who have patterns of controlling and violent behavior do not end cleanly. They cycle. The person leaves, things calm down, there are promises. There is a version of the person that seems manageable or even good for a while. And then the cycle starts again. Martha had recognized at some point that the cycle was dangerous. She had taken legal action. She had obtained a restraining order against Callahan. She had put a legal barrier between herself and a man she knew was capable of hurting her. That is not a small thing. That takes courage. That takes acknowledging to yourself and to the court system that the person you have been with is someone you need protection from. But then at some point before the summer of 2018, he was back in her house, back in her life, living under her roof on Crouse Street in Akron, while Martha tried to manage the situation she found herself in. We do not know exactly what Callahan said or did to get back in. We do not know what promises he made or what version of himself he presented. What we know is that by the time the summer of 2018 arrived, he was there, present, a man with a 30-year criminal history and a documented pattern of domestic violence, living in the home of a woman who had previously taken out a restraining order against him. And the people who could have done something about it had already decided Martha's concerns were not worth taking seriously. There is something important to understand about how paranoid schizophrenia affected Martha's relationship with the police and the court system. When you have a history of mental illness and a history of calling police, a pattern develops. Officers respond. They assess the situation. Nothing appears immediately dangerous. They leave. Over time, the calls start to feel routine. The person making them starts to feel like a recurring problem rather than someone genuinely at risk. The system stops hearing them. This is not unique to Martha Freitag. It is a documented pattern that plays out in domestic violence cases involving victims with mental health histories all over the country. The very condition that made Martha more vulnerable also made the people around her less likely to believe she needed protecting. Callahan knew this. Whether consciously or not, he was living in the home of a woman whose credibility with local police had been eroded over years of calls they had decided were not emergencies. He had a shield around him that Martha had not created intentionally, but that existed nonetheless. In late July 2018, when Martha called police to ask about reinstating her restraining order, she was making one final attempt to use the system to protect herself. She was telling them as directly as she could that she was afraid of the man in her house. They did not act. What happened next was entirely predictable to anyone who had been paying attention. Martha Freitag made that call on July 31st, 2018. It was the last time she was heard from alive. What happened inside that house on Crouse Street in the days that followed is something David Callahan has never fully explained. He pleaded guilty. There was no trial, no testimony from the stand, no account of the final hours of Martha Freitag's life from the man who ended it. What investigators pieced together from the physical evidence is this. At some point in late July or early August 2018, David Callahan beat Martha Robin Freitag to death inside her own home. The medical examiner found evidence of significant blunt force trauma. A rope was still tied around her neck when her body was eventually recovered weeks later. She did not die quickly. She did not die cleanly. She suffered inside the walls of her own home while the world outside carried on completely unaware. When it was over, Callahan did not call for help. He did not panic and run. He did not fall apart. He looked at the body of the woman he had just killed and he made a series of deliberate, calculated decisions designed to make her disappear completely. He wrapped her body in plastic. He covered it in bedding. He carried her out to the fire pit in the backyard of her own home and buried her in a shallow grave. Then he went back inside and gathered every possession Martha owned that could confirm she had ever been alive in that house. Her clothes, her personal belongings, everything he could find. He burned it all in that same fire pit on top of her body. Think about what that requires. Not just physically, but psychologically. This was not someone who snapped and immediately fell apart with guilt. This was someone who, after committing murder, had the presence of mind to execute a methodical cover-up, to think through what evidence existed, to systematically eliminate it piece by piece, to bury a human being in the ground and then walk back inside and continue living as though nothing had happened. Callahan continued living in Martha's house after he killed her. He was still there weeks later when Kim started asking questions. Still there when neighbors began noticing Martha's absence. Still sleeping in the house where he had beaten a woman to death and buried her 10 feet from the back door. The audacity of that is difficult to fully absorb. Most killers run. They put distance between themselves and the crime. Callahan stayed. He had buried the evidence, and he believed that was enough. He believed that Martha Freitag was the kind of woman nobody would come looking for seriously. A woman whose calls to police had been dismissed so many times that he had reason to believe her disappearance would be treated the same way. He was almost right. In the weeks after Martha's death, Callahan went about his life on Crouse Street with remarkable composure. Neighbors, who later spoke to investigators, described seeing him around the property as usual. Nothing obviously different. Nothing that suggested the woman who lived there was buried in the backyard. Martha's phone had gone silent on July 31st. For over a month after that, there was nothing. No calls, no messages. Just silence. And while that silence stretched on, David Callahan waited. confident that Martha Freitag would simply be forgotten, that the system that had dismissed her concerns while she was alive would continue to dismiss her absence now that she was dead. He was counting on Martha being invisible in death the way she had been made to feel invisible in life. What he did not count on was Kim. Kim Freitag reported her mother missing on September 5th, 2018. She had not heard from Martha since July 31st. 5 weeks of silence. 5 weeks of unanswered calls and unread messages from a woman who had never gone quiet like this before. 5 weeks of a feeling in Kim's stomach that she could not shake no matter how many times she tried to tell herself there was a reasonable explanation. When she finally went to the Akron Police Department and filed a missing person report, she did not just say her mother had stopped answering her phone. She told them everything. She told them about David Callahan. She told them about his history of violence. She told them about the restraining order her mother had previously taken out against him. She told them about the call Martha had made on July 31st, asking about reinstating that restraining order. She gave them every piece of context they needed to understand that this was not a woman who had simply decided to disappear. This was a woman who had been afraid and who was now gone. Police went to the house on Krause Street. Callahan was there. They spoke to him. They looked around. They left. Kim called again. She pushed harder. She told officers that her mother had specifically said before she went silent that if anything ever happened to her, Callahan would be responsible. That Martha had told people directly that she was afraid he was going to hurt her. That this was not a hunch. This was a woman who had predicted her own fate and told people about it while she was still alive. Police told Kim there was nothing they could do. Martha was an adult. There was no evidence of a crime. Without a body, without physical evidence, without something concrete they could point to, their hands were tied. Kim did not accept that answer. She started doing what the police would not. She went to the house herself. She put up missing person flyers around the neighborhood with her mother's face on them. She talked to neighbors. She talked to anyone who had seen Martha or had any contact with her in the weeks before she went silent. She built her own picture of what had happened because the people whose job it was to do that were not doing it. And all the while, David Callahan was still in that house. When Kim came around asking questions, he was there. When investigators made their brief visits, he was there, living his life on Krause Street with the composure of a man who had convinced himself he had gotten away with it. What Kim was experiencing in those weeks is something that families of missing persons describe over and over again in cases like this one. The wall. The sense that the system has looked at the situation and made a decision that it is not a priority. That the person who is gone is not the kind of person whose disappearance demands urgent action. That you are going to have to fight for every single inch of attention you can get. Martha Freitag's mental health history was working against her daughter even after her death. The same pattern of dismissal that had followed Martha when she was alive was now following Kim as she tried to find her. Officers who had responded to Martha's calls before and filed them away as non-emergencies were now applying the same judgment to her disappearance. Kim kept pushing. She kept calling. She kept showing up. She refused to let her mother become another case that quietly stalled and was eventually forgotten. And then, something strange happened. The family received an anonymous message. The message said that if David Callahan was ever going to get rid of someone, he would bury them in the fire pit in the backyard. Kim took that message straight to the police. This time, they listened. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed to Crime on Record yet, do it now. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Every case. On record. David Callahan sat in the Summit County Jail through the autumn and winter of 2018 and into 2019. while prosecutors built the case against him. The evidence was not complicated. It was overwhelming. Investigators had the physical remains of Martha Freitag recovered from the fire pit in her own backyard. They had the rope still tied around her neck. They had the forensic evidence of blunt force trauma consistent with a prolonged and violent beating. They had the plastic and bedding Callahan had used to wrap her body. They had evidence that her possessions had been deliberately burned in that same fire pit in what prosecutors described as a systematic attempt to destroy every trace of her existence. They had Callahan's 30-year criminal record, including prior domestic violence charges. They had the restraining order Martha had previously taken out against him. They had the phone call she made on July 31st asking about reinstating that order. They had neighbors who had heard violent arguments coming from that house in the period before Martha disappeared. They had a timeline that placed Callahan in that house throughout the entire period Martha was missing. And they had Kim, who had documented everything. Every phone call she made to police, every visit she made to the house, every conversation she had with neighbors and family members. Kim had been building a record of her own investigation for 6 weeks, and that record corroborated everything the physical evidence was saying. Callahan had no defense that could survive contact with that body of evidence. He knew it. His attorneys knew it. On March 27, 2019, David Callahan stood before Summit County Common Pleas Court and pleaded guilty. Guilty to murder. Guilty to tampering with evidence. Guilty to gross abuse of a corpse. Guilty to domestic violence. There was no trial. No opportunity for Kim and the Freitag family to sit in a courtroom and hear witnesses describe what happened to Martha. No public airing of the full details of what Callahan had done, just a guilty plea that closed the legal proceedings as efficiently as possible. For families in situations like this one, the guilty plea is a complicated thing. On one hand, it spares them the trauma of a trial. It removes the uncertainty of a verdict. It means the man who killed their loved one has formally admitted in open court what he did. On the other hand, it means a great deal never gets said publicly. The full picture of what happened inside that house on Krause Street in late July 2018 remains incomplete, because the only person who knows exactly what happened chose to plead guilty rather than explain himself. Callahan said nothing meaningful at his plea hearing. He admitted the charges. He did not elaborate. He did not look at the not explain. He did not look at the Freitag family and give them the one thing that a guilty plea cannot provide: an answer to the question of why. Sentencing was scheduled for May 6, 2019. In the weeks between the guilty plea and sentencing, the Freitag family prepared themselves for the moment they had been waiting for since September 2018. The moment when a judge would look at David Callahan and tell him what the rest of his life was going to look like. Summit County Prosecutor Sherry Bevan Walsh made the position of her office clear in the lead-up to sentencing. She said that David Callahan had inflicted torture and an incredible amount of pain on the Freitag family, that he had murdered Martha Freitag, buried her, and burned all of her possessions, that he deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars. She was not wrong. On May 6, 2019, Summit County Common Pleas Judge Allison Breaux sentenced David Callahan to life in prison. The judge designated him a major violent offender. Callahan would not be eligible for parole until he had served a minimum of 18 years of his sentence. He was 53 years old at sentencing. He will be 71 years old at his earliest possible parole date. The judge made clear that spending the rest of his life behind bars was exactly what his actions had earned him. Callahan was led out of the courtroom and into the custody of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, where he remains today. For the Freitag family, it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The legal process was over. The man who killed Martha was going to prison. But the grief does not end when the sentence is handed down. The questions do not stop. The absence does not fill. Martha Robin Freitag was gone, and no sentence, however just, changes that fact. David Callahan is in prison. The case is closed. Justice, in the narrow legal sense of that word, was served. But there is a question that the guilty plea and the sentencing did not answer. A question that sits at the heart of this entire case and that cannot be resolved by putting one man behind bars. Why did the system fail Martha Freitag so completely and so consistently at every single point where it had the opportunity to protect her? This is not a question about one police officer making one bad decision on one afternoon. This is a question about a pattern, a systematic, documented, repeating pattern that shows up in domestic violence cases across the United States with disturbing regularity. And understanding that pattern is the only way to understand how Martha ended up in that fire pit. Martha Freitag had paranoid schizophrenia. That diagnosis followed her everywhere. It followed her into every interaction she had with law enforcement. Every time she called police, every time she asked for help, every time she tried to use the system to protect herself, that diagnosis was in the background, shaping how the people on the other end of the phone or standing at her door assessed her credibility. Research on domestic violence and mental health consistently shows that victims with psychiatric histories face significantly higher barriers to being believed and protected by law enforcement. Officers who respond to repeated calls from the same address over time develop what researchers call call fatigue. The calls stop feeling like emergencies. The person making them stops feeling like a credible reporter of danger. The situation gets filed away as a chronic problem rather than an acute threat. Martha had been calling police for years. She had a history with the Akron Police Department that preceded David Callahan entirely. By the time she was in genuine mortal danger, the officers responding to her calls had already formed a judgment about the reliability of her reports. That judgment was wrong. It cost her her life. But it was not just the police. The courts had the opportunity to act when Martha sought to reinstate her restraining order in late July 2018. A restraining order is a legal instrument. It requires a judge to assess the credibility of the person seeking it and the level of threat they face. Martha had previously been granted one against Callahan. She was now asking for it back because the threat had returned. That request was not treated with the urgency it deserved. Think about what Martha was doing in the final weeks of her life. She was not passive. She was not simply hoping things would get better. She was actively working the system, calling police, seeking legal protection, trying to create barriers between herself and a man she knew was going to hurt her. She did everything right. She used every tool available to her, and every tool failed her. The anonymous tip that eventually led investigators to her body came not from police work, but from someone in the community who had information and chose to share it. The break in the case did not come from the official investigation. It came from outside it. That is a damning reflection of how seriously Martha's disappearance was being treated by the people whose job it was to find her. Kim Freitag carried the investigation herself for 6 weeks. A daughter, not a detective, not a forensic investigator, a daughter who loved her mother and refused to accept the answer the system kept giving her. Without Kim, the case against Callahan might never have been made. Without Kim, Martha might still be in that fire pit. That should not be how it works. The burden of investigating a missing person's disappearance should not fall on a grieving family member who is simultaneously processing the fear that the person they love most in the world is dead. The system exists precisely so that burden does not fall on individuals. And in Martha Freitag's case, the system abdicated that responsibility entirely. There are thousands of Martha Freitags. Women whose mental health histories, whose economic circumstances, whose relationship with law enforcement before the crisis arrived made them less visible, less credible, less urgent in the eyes of the institutions that existed to protect them. Women whose killers understood that visibility and exploited it. David Callahan did not choose Martha randomly. He chose a woman whose calls to police had been dismissed before. He chose a woman he believed the system would not fight hard for. He was almost right. The lesson of Martha Freitag's case is not that one police department in Akron failed on one occasion. The lesson is that the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable people in our society are riddled with assumptions and biases that make those systems least effective precisely when they are needed most. Mental illness is not a disqualifier for credibility. A history of calling police is not evidence that a person's concerns are not real. And a woman who tells you she is afraid of the man in her house deserves to be taken seriously, regardless of her psychiatric history. Martha told them. She told them clearly. She told them repeatedly. She told them with her words and with her actions and with every phone call she made in the final weeks of her life. They did not listen. Martha Robin Freitag was 54 years old when David Callahan beat her to death in her own home. She was not a headline before this happened. She was not a name that appeared in national news coverage. She was not the kind of case that generates documentaries and podcasts and true crime specials. She was a woman living a quiet and difficult life in Akron, Ohio, who was let down by the people and institutions around her and was murdered by a man she had tried to leave. That is why this case matters. Not because it is exceptional, but because it is not. Cases like Martha's happen with a frequency that should disturb every single person watching this video. Women with mental health histories, women in volatile domestic situations, women whose relationships with law enforcement have been complicated by circumstances beyond their control are dying because the systems designed to protect them are not designed with them in mind. David Callahan pleaded guilty on March 27, 2019. He was sentenced to life in prison on May 6, 2019 by Summit County Common Pleas Judge Allison Breaux. He will not be eligible for parole until he has served a minimum of 18 years. He was designated a major violent offender. He sits in an Ohio prison today and will likely die there. That is justice in the legal sense. It is the best outcome the system could produce after the fact. But justice after the fact is a poor substitute for protection before the fact. Martha Freitag did not need a life sentence handed down in 2019. She needed a restraining order enforced in 2018. She needed a police department that took her calls seriously. She needed a system that looked at a woman saying, "I am afraid of the man in my house," and responded with urgency rather than fatigue. She did not get any of that. Kim Freitag fought for her mother when nobody else would. For 6 weeks, she carried an investigation that an entire police department had set down. She made the calls. She put up the flyers. She pushed and pushed and pushed until someone finally listened. Without Kim, without that relentless refusal to accept the answers she kept being given, this case might never have been solved. Callahan might still be living free. Martha might still be in that fire pit with nobody knowing what happened to her. If this case has taught you anything, let it be this. When someone tells you they are afraid, believe them. When a family member tells you something is wrong, listen. The people closest to a victim almost always know before anyone else does. Kim knew. She knew from the first week of silence. The system just refused to hear her until it was too late to matter. If you've made it this far into this video, you care about cases like Martha's. You care about the people who fall through the cracks. You care about the truth being told even when it is uncomfortable. Subscribe to Crime on Record right now if you have not already. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a case. Every case we cover is documented, verified, and told with the seriousness it deserves. We do not sensationalize. We do not speculate. We follow the evidence, and we tell you what it says. Martha Robin Freitag deserved better from the system that was supposed to protect her. The least we can do is make sure her story is told, heard, and remembered. Rest in peace, Martha. Every case on record.